Nobody talks about the empire that existed before the Mongols destroyed everything. And the reason nobody talks about it is not because it was small or insignificant. It is because someone made sure you would forget it. In 1257, Baghdad was the richest, most educated, most advanced city on the face of the earth. Over 1 million people lived there. Doctors were performing surgeries. Mathematicians were solving equations that Europe would not discover for another 500 years. Poets, philosophers, astronomers, all working in one city at the same time. And then in the span of a single year, it was gone. Not weakened. Not defeated. Gone. The question is not what the Mongols did. The question is why history made sure you never learned what they destroyed. The empire was called the Abbasid Caliphate, and it ran from 750 to 1258 CE, over 500 years. At its peak it stretched from the edges of North Africa to the borders of Central Asia. But raw geography is not the point. The point is what was happening inside that geography. In Baghdad, the Abbasid rulers built something called the House of Wisdom. This was not a library in the way you picture a library. It was a translation engine. Scholars were brought in from Persia, India, Greece, and paid, handsomely, to translate every significant text of human knowledge into Arabic. Medical texts, mathematical treatises, astronomical charts. Works of philosophy that had already been lost in their original languages were surviving only because the Abbasids decided to preserve them. Europe was in what historians politely call the early medieval period. Baghdad was doing something else entirely. The names that came out of this empire should be household names, and they are not. A man named Al-Khwarizmi sat in Baghdad in the 9th century and essentially invented algebra. The word algebra comes directly from the title of his book. The word algorithm comes from the Latinized version of his name. Every piece of software running on every device you own traces back, in a direct intellectual line, to a scholar working in Baghdad over 1,000 years ago. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, wrote a medical encyclopedia in the early 11th century that was used as the primary textbook in European medical schools until the 1700s. Not the 1100s. The 1700s. Nearly 700 years after he wrote it. The banking system the Abbasids developed used paper credit notes they called sack. That word, sack, is the direct origin of the English word check. They had hospitals in the 9th century that included separate wards for patients with mental illness. They had a postal network that connected Cairo to Central Asia with relay stations and timed routes. This was a civilization running centuries ahead of where it is placed in the popular imagination. But here is where the story becomes genuinely uncomfortable. By the time the Mongols arrived at the gates of Baghdad in 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate had already been dying for 200 years. The caliphs, the religious and political leaders of the empire, had been reduced to ceremonial figureheads as early as the 900s. Real military and political power had passed first to Persian Buyid commanders, and then to Seljuk Turks. The caliph sat in his palace in Baghdad, issued proclamations that nobody was required to follow, and served as a symbol of Islamic legitimacy for rulers who held all the actual power. The empire had fragmented long before the Mongols came. The Fatimids in Egypt had their own caliphate and considered the Abbasids illegitimate. Dynasties across Persia and Central Asia operated as independent states. What the Mongols invaded was not an empire at its height. It was the hollowed-out shell of one. Hulagu Khan did not break a strong civilization. He buried something that had already collapsed from within. The erasure happened in layers. The first layer was the Mongols themselves. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 killed somewhere between 200,000 and 800,000 people. The estimates vary that wildly, which itself tells you how thoroughly the record was destroyed. What happened to the House of Wisdom is debated by historians, but the broader reality is not. The infrastructure that had sustained Abbasid intellectual life, the institutions, the patronage networks, the scholars, the libraries, was dismantled in weeks. There is a famous account, impossible to fully verify, that books from Baghdad's libraries were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran black with ink. Whether or not that specific image is literally accurate, it captures something true about the scale of what was lost. The The second layer of erasure is older and more ironic. The Abbasids themselves came to power in 750 by overthrowing the previous dynasty, the Umayyads, and they dealt with their predecessors the way empires always deal with the people they replace. They destroyed the record. Umayyad monuments were torn down. Umayyad administrative documents were suppressed. The historical narrative of the Islamic world was rewritten with the Abbasids at the center. The civilization that spent 5 centuries preserving the knowledge of the ancient world came to power by erasing the civilization before it. That is not a footnote. That is the structure of how power works. The third layer is the one that affects you most directly. The standard way history is taught in the Western world frames the medieval period as the Dark Ages, a gap between the classical world of Greece and Rome and the Renaissance that eventually followed. That framing only makes sense if you assume that when European scholarly production slowed down, scholarly production everywhere slowed down. The Abbasid Golden Age demolishes that assumption completely. The reason it gets a paragraph in a textbook instead of a chapter is not because it was minor. It is because the intellectual framework most Western history was built around had no comfortable place for a non-European civilization that was, for several centuries, the most advanced on Earth. The Mongols get the credit, or the blame, for ending the Islamic Golden Age. But the more honest version of the story is darker than that. An empire rose to power by erasing its predecessors. It built something extraordinary, genuine, world-altering, irreplaceable. Then it let that achievement hollow out over 2 centuries while the institution decayed around it. The Mongols arrived at the end of that process, not the beginning. What they destroyed was already a ruin wearing the clothes of an empire. And then history buried even that version of events, leaving behind a simplified story about conquest that lets everyone involved, the conquerors, the conquered, and the historians who followed, avoid the more difficult question. Which is, how does a civilization that advanced disappear so completely that most people today have never heard of it in any real depth? And what does it say about our own moment that we still haven't answered that question honestly?